afternoon, everyone. It's really a joy to be here. I was born in Monroe along with Delta Airlines, and my trajectory's not quite as big as theirs, but somehow we lost them to Atlanta. But anyway, I'm glad to be back in Mississippi. I have a lot of friends here, and I think that the way we compete for that last space on every measure that's good and top of every measure that's bad is whoever had the last hurricane or impact from the last hurricane. So I think that's contributes sometimes to who ends up on the bottom. I also want to start by congratulating the newborn and that family to, I don't know where you went, and to say, talk, 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 read, 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 listen, listen, listen. We need to get those children with lots of language before they get to kindergarten so that they will be ready to learn to read. So that's a really important thing that all of you as adults can do, is to talk and read to the children in your lives. Where's my clicker? I'm going to try to walk you through the history of what we did over in Mississippi, and I would be happy to entertain any questions as we go. Before I begin, I also always want to acknowledge our benefactor, Mr. Jim Barksdale, who is the CEO of Netscape and really has made a difference in the lives of many Mississippians, not just in reading, but in a lot of aspects. So let's get going here. These are our banner and we're proud to show these headlines for the New York Times. The first one is in 2019 when we first hit the national average for fourth grade reading. The cut line says the state's reliance on cognitive science explains why. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that cognitive science is. The most recent one is from Nicholas Kristof, who visited us last May. And wrote this long piece. He's doing a series, if you all are familiar with his work in the New York Times, he's doing a series of challenges of the country, and literacy is certainly one of those. And so he came and spent 2 days with us and learned a lot about what we're doing even now. So the top headline, though, is really about that we know how to teach reading. The good news about the challenge here is that we do know how to teach reading, and 95% of our children ought to be able to read if taught well. So this is not a problem we need to figure out. It's just a problem that we need to implement the solution in everywhere. This is a little bit difficult, depending on where you're sitting, chart to read. But at the far left, this is the fourth grade reading trajectory. So the far left column are the line of states, and you'll see Mississippi down there at the bottom, and I don't know where Louisiana and New Mexico are, but we often battle there at the bottom. That's 2003. The middle chart is 2019, when we hit the national average, and the third column is 2022, post-pandemic, when we made it all the way to 21st. I'm here to tell you we have a long way to go. Not all of our children are reading proficiently, but it certainly feels good to be off the bottom. This chart is our African American students. One of the things that's confusing about the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which for those of you who are not educators, that is a national test that's administered 4th, 8th, and 12th grade in reading, math, and science. It's administered every 2 years. We got off cycle a little bit because of COVID, so 2019 was when we hit the national average. 2022 was post-COVID, and while we had dropped a point or two, we were still ahead of the national average. And that, for us, we were kind of holding our breaths. We weren't really sure if we were going to sustain this growth after the pandemic. And what it proved to us is that we really had developed a solid fabric of reading instruction across the state. So fingers crossed, we still have a long way to go. But when you disaggregate the data, one of the reasons that Massachusetts is always at the top, or the Department of Defense Schools is always at the top, is that's across the board. When you look at the subgroups, you look at low-income families and you look at African American and children of color, Massachusetts is way down in the middle. They are nowhere near the top. So we are 5th in the nation when it comes to African American growth, and we are 2nd in the nation, only after Florida, for low-income families. Nicholas Kristof said in his article, it proves that there are no more excuses, that poor kids, kids of color, can learn to read just like everybody else. They just need the good instruction that everybody deserves. So here is a nutshell of what we did, and this is a suite of policies that began in 2005 and goes all the way to 2016 when we passed the law that required colleges of ed to administer a reading test to their graduates before they could be certified. So I'm going to march you through these on the next slide, but the first one is a licensure requirement that Barksdale appealed to the state board to implement to increase what we were doing in teacher preparation programs. We'll talk about that a little bit. The second one is Common Core Standards. We implemented those in 2010. Early Learning Collaboratives, this was a pre-K effort that happened in 2013. Shortly after that, the Literacy-Based Promotion Act, which was the big law, the third grade law that is really the light switch in some ways, and then the Foundations of Reading Assessment. So there was a whole series of things. Some of this was serendipitous and some of this was strategic. So for those states that are attempting to replicate what we did, I think it's important to look at the sequence in which we did things, because they weren't all strategic, but they turned out to have worked really well. And so you don't need to do trial and error. You can learn from us. So I like to say this was no miracle. This was a marathon. And what I'm going to walk you through, and there's some cheat sheets on your table, but in 2000, Jim Barksdale came home to his state and said, we need to do something about getting us off the bottom. It was the same year that the National Reading Panel, which was a panel commissioned by the U.S. Congress to get a grip on what we were doing wrong with reading, because we had remained flat for many decades on the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And the report really was a compilation of all of the research that had been going on for 40 years around reading, and put it in a book and tried to disseminate it so that states would adopt new practices. We hit the ground running in 2000 when that panel report came out. We digested it, we took it apart, we looked carefully at what it was recommending, and we began to do our work to try to see what it would take to get the science of reading into reading instruction and into teacher preparation. I want to give you a little bit of lesson about the science of reading to break down the mystery. I'm going to pause here and do that. There's something in the science of reading called the simple view of reading. You educators, raise your hand if you know what the simple view of reading is. I'm not going to ask you to explain it. It's essentially a math formula. And the purpose of the simple view, it was codified in 1986. That's how long it's been around. And it is essentially this. The purpose of the research was to determine, do you need to teach phonics or not? And what the research determined was, yes, a big bold yes, everybody needs to learn explicit phonics, but it is not sufficient. You also have to have language. So the simple view of reading formula is word recognition, which is essentially phonics, how your brain decodes language, times language comprehension, which is your oral language, the words you know, equals reading comprehension. The reason it's a math formula and the reason it's multiplied is if either one of those is deficient, it reduces the total. So you can't get to 1 unless both of those multiplicands are 1, are a whole. So we've settled the debate about whether or not phonics is important. It is essential, but it is not sufficient. And so we've learned a lot, and we are beginning to see materials change to do a better job of teaching phonics. All right, so that was in 2000. And we began to work in schools, K-3 schools. We sent out reading coaches into those schools. We trained those reading coaches with the national experts from across the country, brought them into Mississippi. We trained 30 reading coaches, and we sent them out into schools. We were at any point in time in about 90 schools. We touched about 200 over the course of our tenure in those schools. In 2003, we took a close look at teacher preparation. We were funding the faculty members in the 8 public institutions to see if we could get it right from the start. My introduction to the Institute was actually to do an evaluation of that program, And the report I wrote was pretty scathing, and I think they figured I'd never get a job anywhere else, and so the Institute hired me to help them work on the teacher prep. And it's a piece of the Institute work that I've done since then. In 2005, am I right here? We led the charge to, after that study was done, and we determined that not all of those programs were teaching all components of reading, which had been codified by that national report. So there are 5 components of reading: phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and reading comprehension. And so we were looking at all of the teacher prep programs to see what they were doing to teach their candidates that. And what we saw was not pretty, and we also saw that the faculty had never heard of the National Reading Panel report or didn't believe in the National Reading Panel report and were just doing a variety of things. Some of them weren't even teaching all 5 components of reading. So Barksdale went to the state board and said, we think you need to create at least a minimum requirement for what teacher candidates are going to learn. And so we created 2 courses. We helped the universities craft those syllabi, and then we kept on going. Those 2 courses are still on the books, and we are now working with the State Department to continue to improve what the 12 required hours are in reading. In 2007, that was the last year that the state fully funded the schools, our funding formula, and you'll see a bit of a slide after that, although you'll see impact on literacy when we infused more money down the road, down the pike. In 2006, and these orange arrows, the blue arrows are the direct impact of Barksdale. These orange arrows are things that the state did, either the legislature or the State Department. All right, in 2006 is when we implemented the Common Core. That plateau that follows, I think, is primarily because the state shifted its focus at that point from literacy instruction to helping schools adopt Common Core and shift their instruction. It dramatically, if you all are familiar with Common Core, dramatically changed it raised the standards and changed how we were doing instruction. It had a larger impact on math, actually, than it did on literacy. So while the state was focused on implementing Common Core, Barksdale turned to looking at leadership, and we developed a leadership model for what principals ought to know in terms of implementing literacy in their schools. In 2013, we instituted something called the Early Learning Collaboratives, and these are pre-K programs that are community-based. They work between public pre-K, Head Start, and private pre-K, and it's been wildly successful. We are only still serving about a quarter of the students in the state, but it's the kids that are in these Early Learning Collaboratives, the pre-K programs, are outperforming by a long shot those who are in private pre-K or in Head Start programs. So it's something that we're watching because we believe that universal pre-K is really the way to go. Kids don't start where they should. When they get to kindergarten, it's a lot harder to catch them up, which is why you need to talk to that baby. In 2014, we introduced something called LETTERS. You all probably have used LETTERS here. It stands for Language Essentials of Teachers of Reading and Spelling. And it was the professional development that we recommended to the state for the teachers across the state to take advantage of. There are many more vendors of professional development available now, but it was best in the market, and Barksdale had introduced it several years before when we were trying to lift the knowledge of those faculty. In 2015, Barksdale completed the second study of teacher prep. The needle had moved a little bit. This time all 15, public and private, were involved in the study, and this resulted in a governor's task force. The governor was very interested that these recommendations and our findings not just sit on the shelf, and so we created a task force to begin to implement those recommendations. The number one thing that grew out of that was the recognition that we really needed to train our faculty. So Barksdale designed a professional growth model for faculty where we were actually doing what we did with K-3 teachers and training them on the science of reading and actually coaching them, going into their classrooms and coaching them and working with their syllabi. The most recent review by the National Council of Teacher Quality Mississippi had 10 A's among its higher ed programs. Okay, where are we? 10. It's now 2016. We instituted something called the Foundations of Reading Test. Louisiana has this. This is the certification test that new candidates must pass in order to be certified. At least that's the case in Mississippi. I learned in my meeting earlier this morning that that may not be the case here, that you can hire teachers without having to pass that test. In Mississippi, you have to pass that test if you're going to be certified. In 2017, we instituted that professional growth model for faculty following the task force. In 2019, we reached the national average for fourth grade reading. In 2020, Barksdale launched something called the Path Forward. Some of you may have heard the Emily Hanford American Public Media series. Her most recent is Sold a Story. We were featured on the segment prior to that called Hard Words, Why Our Kids Aren't Learning to Read. She came and looked at what we were doing in teacher prep, and we were flooded with calls. Probably in about a 10-day period, I'd heard from 20 states. So I called my colleague in North Carolina, who was the first person to call me to say, can you come do one of those studies for us in North Carolina? And as the result of that, we created something called the Path Forward. It is a multi-state initiative that is now working in 18 states. And its purpose is to embed the science of reading in teacher prep so that candidates are getting this and we don't have to keep retraining teachers when they get to the classroom. This last cohort includes New York and Connecticut, big states that are, you would think, far ahead of this, but slow to come to drinking the water of literacy and science. The Path Forward is really designed to pull together the folks on the ground that don't generally talk to each other. Everybody has some responsibility for K-12 achievement, but only a few people really have accountability for K-12 achievement. And higher ed really sits outside that accountability. They are the engine that produces new teachers every year, and we can tell them what they need to teach, but they don't have to, because there's this firewall called academic freedom that I think is not well interpreted. And so we have a long way to go to making sure that everybody who has some responsibility also has some accountability. That's work still to be done. In 2014, we bested the national average on the NAEP scores, and in 2023, we launched 2 legacy projects that I'm going to talk about a little bit to sort of keep the ethos of Barksdale alive. One of the functions of the Institute really was to kind of be a voice that could say things that the State Department couldn't say, that could go to the legislature and lobby for things that we thought would make a difference. And we've been involved in a lot of that legislative work to move, and that era that pointed to all of those policies that were put into place. So that's essentially the role that the Institute has played. I want to back up and tell you a story about Jim Barksdale that really is one reason this chart looks like it does. The day I met Jim Barksdale, he said to me, and having come from FedEx, he said, if FedEx can get a package from the middle of Manhattan to the middle of Tokyo in 48 hours, guarantee its arrival on time and intact, we ought to be able to teach every child in Mississippi to read. And so his business acumen, he was a risk taker and willing to try things. He's quoted as saying, if something isn't working, do something else. Don't just keep doing the thing that's not working. And I think for a long time that's what we've been doing in reading instruction. He said, keep the main thing, and that was third grade reading. And by doing that, we actually hit that target. We have now created this reading clinic, which is focused on 4th through 8th grade, making 8th grade NAEP our new metric. And so stay tuned. We hope we're going to create a model that will go to scale and that will help that segment, because we have lots of kids who struggle in literacy in those grades, and we no longer teach reading in those grades, even though there's a lot of support to be had. All right, so here are a couple of legacy projects since the Institute closed in June. One is Talk from the Start. This was a project we did with the the Mississippi Children's Museum, and it was to spread the word that we need to talk and sing and read to our children to get them ready for kindergarten. It launched in 2019. That partnership with the museum now took over that project, so it lives on. One thing that I think the Institute did well, which was to partner with a variety of folks around literacy through the decades, and so when it came time to close our tent, we had partners to pass stuff off, so some of the work is sustained, and that's a good thing. Often when organizations close, the work stops. The Big Dippers Project, I've been working with Teach for America in Mississippi for 30 years, and have always been critical of how they train Corps members to teach reading. I've got a number of TFA folks in here. And I kid them because I say, you came out of the womb reading, and so you assumed you knew how to teach reading. And so in February of 2020, the executive director of the National Teach for America, this was right after we had hit the national average, called me and said, would you bring a panel to our Leadership Institute in Houston and talk about what you did? It was sort of this. We've passed that mark, but past the time. But so we told them, and then about 2 weeks later, the pandemic hit, and she called me and said, would Barksdale put together a reading science introduction for Corps members? We're going to do Summer Institute, which is something that they do to bring in new Corps members every year in the summer. We're going to do it nationally. We're going to do it virtually. Will you build us an introduction to the science of reading? And I felt like the dog that caught the car. So I pulled together a group. We call ourselves the Big Dippers because if you plot the organizations on the map, it looks like the Big Dipper. And so we sort of stuck with that. It now lives at the Hill Center. The Hill Center was one of our partners that helped us build it, and it is now branded for TFA. We also unbranded it and created a separate one for a wider audience. But I'm understanding from my TFA folks here that it's still being used, and so finally, all of those TFA Corps members are getting a good dose of the science of reading on day one. We hope it's going to make an impact. And as we know, they go on to become advocates in a variety of forms, and so it further perpetuates the science of reading. The path forward we've talked about already. You can see who were in those cohorts. Cohort 3 is Connecticut, Idaho, Illinois, New Mexico, New York, and Washington. It now lives at the Hunt Institute in North Carolina. They were partnering with us from the beginning. We have spawned something called Lunch and Literacy. During the pandemic, this began with 8 staff members at the Barksdale Reading Institute when I realized everybody had to go home and work virtually. And I said, we're going to dig into the research that we've been talking about for a long time. And so every Monday I would send out a research article, and on Friday we would gather virtually for lunch to talk about it. The purpose of it was to bridge research to practice. It's a common lament that we have all this research, like the Simple View of Reading, which has been around since 1986, and yet the average teacher does not know anything about it. This group is now 250. It meets every Friday. I passed it off to the Right to Read Project, which is a group out of California, and they are sustaining it. It meets every Friday. If you're interested, let me know, and I can get you hooked up to it. The responsibility is that you read the research so that you can come and participate in the conversation. It has all the big name, Marilyn Adams, all those folks that we brought in, Marilyn Adams, Jan Hasbrook, the reading folks that you educators would know about, tune in every week, and with practitioners, and we talk about how to bridge that gap. So that's a really important legacy. What did I do? I guess I'm gone. All right, we're almost done here. Mississippi Reading Clinic is to take a focus on 4th through 8th grade literacy. For those of you who are worried about workforce development, if we don't fix the 4th through 8th grade literacy, the problem is going to perpetuate, because if kids aren't strong readers when they leave 4th grade, they don't read very much during the middle school. And if they haven't read very much during middle school, when they get to high school, they don't have the vocabulary and they don't have the background to do high school level work. And so then it compounds further by the time they get to the college gate. So this is the next thing on the horizon. You're going to see more about this. This is part of what that high dosage tutoring is about, is that we still have kids who struggle to read after those learning to read years, and it's important work going on around the country. But we're going to try to get it off the ground in Mississippi. The legislature gave us $500,000 last year to launch it. Kellogg is a big supporter of it. It is distinct from Barksdale, but Mr. Barksdale gave us some seed money to also get it off the ground. We met with legislators yesterday, and we believe they're going to re-up it for another year. Our hope is that it will become a line item in the legislative budget. And finally, the last project, which is the biggest project that we've done, after all of those years that we were working in those schools in K-3, helping teachers figure out what materials to use and how to teach reading effectively, when I knew that the Reading Institute was going to close, I said to Jim, we've got all this stuff, it needs to live on. And we approached PBS in Washington, who had done a documentary of our work early on, and I said, I really went to them saying, can you help me build a website? And they were so intrigued with our taxonomy that they said, I think we ought to partner on this. Thank God, because when the Institute closed, officially, I had a place to rest it. And so PBS in Washington, the flagship station of PBS, WETA, is the host. Some of you are familiar with Reading Rockets in Colorado, Colorado. Those are two literacy websites that WETA sponsors. This will sit next to those. The difference is this is strictly a teacher educator website. It will be free to all teachers pre-K through 6th grade who teach reading and writing. We have heard already registered, we've launched a prototype. Only about 10% of the content has been loaded thus far, but we've already heard from all states in 30 countries. So we think we're onto something here. We hope it will be a durable site for teachers to hang on to and learn on their own, and also learn in groups. We're doing some things to help support teacher groups, professional learning communities, and at school level. We're working with this Chief State School Officer organization to get this also as a feature on all state education websites. So we've done a lot of work in that time. This is the taxonomy I'm referring to. It is likened to the periodic table of reading. I have one example here. You can download it from the site, but for those of you who are interested in all of the elements that go into teaching reading, it's all here. This is the big picture. You click on these boxes and it will take you down a chute that tells you, if you want to learn about phonics, it will tell you everything you need to know about how to teach phonics. The purpose of it, how it fits into the reading instruction, how do you know if your kid has mastered it, videos showing you how to do it, and lesson plans that you can put into your classroom. Again, it's designed for teachers pre-K to 6, and it will be free. Okay, I think that's it. Oh, one more slide, 2 more slides. I want to let you know about some of those national references that I talked about. American Public Media, you should Google those 2 bullets and take a listen. These are about 50 minutes long, and they will help you understand why we are in the shape we're in terms of reading. It has been primarily that reading has been a philosophy, not a science, and it's time to turn the page on that, because we have a lot of cognitive science knowing exactly how the brain processes language to teach reading. So those are 2 really good ones. The Reading League is a national organization. It was funded by Pleasant Rowland, who was the American Doll originator. She was very interested in literacy. She gave $9 million to form this organization. It's based in Syracuse, and it's one of the premier organizations in the country, now forming local chapters. So if Louisiana doesn't have one, you might want to investigate that. Excel in Ed is Jeb Bush's foundation. Our state literacy director, Kim Yanneberg, who I worked closely with when we were rolling out our literacy law, got snapped up by Excel in Ed. She is now working across the country, trying to help work with policymakers and state departments to do what we did in Mississippi. They have a terrific website, and you can go online to see how Louisiana stacks up in terms of a comprehensive literacy plan. Some great resources there. And then the Education Advocacy Center is a brand new effort to try to lift the teaching profession and really create more of a professional support for teachers. that connects the science that we know to their practice. That's brand new, Read Line, and Doug Carnine, who's out of the University of Oregon. Read Line was the chief person at the helm when the reading panel was produced. So these are folks who have come out of retirement to try to get this evidence-based stuff in the hands of folks. It's brand new. I'm working with that group as well. And then finally, I want to give a shout out to your own Barksdale Reading Institute, the Center for Literacy and Learning, formerly the Center for Development and Learning. John Weibel is here, and they do the largest and best reading conference in the country. How many did you have just a year, John? 2,800. It's really terrific. They bring in all the best folks, the gurus, even internationally. It's well attended, and it's connecting research to practice. So I want you to know you've got your own guru right here in your own backyard, and I'm sure he'll be happy to entertain questions after I'm done. So that's it, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you have, and I don't know where I am with time.